You probably think your masculinity is your own, that being called soft or weak might sting, but it isn't fatal. In Viking society, it could get you legally killed. If someone even hinted that you were sexually submissive, you could draw your sword and end their life and walk away without punishment, because according to Viking law, your honor didn't just live in your bravery or your bloodline, it lived in your body, in what you did to others, and what others never did to you. One insult could strip a man of his status, one rumor could end his rights. And for the Vikings, being labeled arga, meaning weak, passive, unmanly, was not just shameful, it was a social death sentence. This wasn't an exception, it was the rule. Their entire society was built around a simple idea: dominance is everything, in war, in sex, in death, in marriage, in magic, and if you weren't the one on top, literally or symbolically, you were nothing. And what makes this more than just an ancient oddity is what happened next. Because these beliefs were not isolated to the cold fjords of Scandinavia, they spread like wildfire through conquest, through slavery, through fear, and eventually they rooted themselves in the cultures that came after, including yours, the shame men still feel when they're called less than a man. That didn't start on the playground. It started in Viking courts. The silent pressure to perform on your wedding night, that didn't come from pop culture. It came from laws that required witnesses. Even the word consummation in legal marriage documents, that's not just tradition, it's the shadow of Viking belief that sex seals a contract and the act defines the man. But that's just the beginning, because Vikings didn't just build a sexual hierarchy, they ritualized it, codified it, weaponized it, and then they made it sacred. Their weddings required proof. Their funerals involved slaves. Their courts decided status not by blood alone, but by what kind of lover you were and whether you had the power to prove it. This is not a story about wild warriors who drank too much and slept with whoever they wanted. This is a story about control, about how a civilization turned intimacy into legislation and desire into dominance, and how that civilization still echoes in every insult, every secret fear, and every cultural expectation surrounding sex and power today. The man who gave us the clearest glimpse into this world was not a Viking at all. His name was Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a diplomat from the Abbasid Caliphate, traveling north through the frozen rivers of Eastern Europe in 922 AD. What he saw during his time with the Viking Rus would haunt him for the rest of his life. He witnessed a funeral, a ritual, a horror show disguised as honor. One slave girl, 6 men, an old woman called the Angel of Death, and a ship set ablaze to carry the dead into the afterlife. At first, people thought he was exaggerating, but archaeology has since confirmed much of what he described. And when you combine his words with Viking sagas, laws, and burial sites, a much clearer picture emerges, one we can no longer ignore. This wasn't just about sex. This was about power transmission, about spiritual dominance, about the belief that if you didn't dominate someone else, physically, sexually, or socially, you could never be truly alive. And if you were ever dominated, you weren't a man anymore, you were a ghost. The Viking legacy is one of shipwrecks and sagas, but beneath all of it is something darker, something still alive, a belief that power must be proven through control, that violence, even sexual violence, is justified if honor demands it. And that shame, once assigned, must be burned out with blood. You will see these values resurface again and again, in ancient rituals, in modern culture, in the silent, wordless expectations we pass down without knowing where they came from. But now you will know. This is not just the history of Viking sexuality. This is the story of how a society built on fear and dominance shaped the laws, the marriages, and the masculinity we live with today. Let's go back. To the courts, where a man could kill with legal blessing. To the bedrooms where shame was recorded like evidence. To the grave ships where death was dressed in ecstasy and fire. because what began in the frost of the north still burns beneath the surface of modern life. Before we dive in, please take a moment to like this video if you're enjoying what we do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see our community gathering from around the world for these deeper explorations. Long before Ahmad ibn Fadlan set foot on the cold northern soil, the Viking world was already a forge of iron, fire, and fear. It was the 9th century, and across the rocky coastlines of what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, small clans ruled with brutal efficiency. The land was not kind, winters were long, food was scarce. Violence was currency, survival was not promised, it was earned, and those who failed to dominate were left behind. This harsh landscape shaped everything the Vikings believed. From the gods they worshipped to the laws they followed, their entire world was built around one core idea: strength must be proven constantly. But strength to them was more than physical power. It was social rank. It was sexual dominance. It was the ability to control others, not just in battle, but in bed, in the home, and even beyond the grave. They didn't believe in moral purity. They believed in personal power. And that belief ran deeper than tradition. It was spiritual. Their gods were not forgiving. They were violent, cunning, vengeful, and deeply obsessed with masculinity and control. Odin, the father of all gods, was known for sacrificing himself to gain wisdom, but he was also mocked for practicing Seder, a type of magic associated with women. Even gods weren't free from the shame of acting feminine. Loki, the trickster, became a literal mother to some of his children by taking female form. He was both feared and humiliated. The lines between male and female, dominance and submission, were not just moral categories, they were cosmic truths. Break them, and you risked spiritual death. Viking society mirrored this divine structure with eerie precision. There were two kinds of people, the free and the enslaved. And among the free there were more lines, men and women, landowners and warriors, elders and outcasts. But at the root of all of it was one question: are you dominant or are you dominated? That question could be answered in battle, of course. But it could also be answered in your bedroom, in your marriage, in the stories people told about you. And if the stories made you seem weak, or worse, passive, then no sword could save you. To be labelled passive was to be marked for social destruction. The term for this was agra, and it didn't simply mean weak. It meant sexually deviant. It meant you had let another man dominate you, not necessarily through desire, but through position. And in a world that viewed dominance as survival, that label was lethal. The laws were clear. If a man called another man Arga, the accused had two choices: challenge him to a duel or live in shame. If he fought and won, his honor was restored. If he refused, the label stuck, and society would treat him as if he had already died. This was not metaphor. A man labeled Arga could lose the right to own land, to speak in court, to lead others, even to pass down his name. But Viking control didn't stop at men. Women too were divided, not just by gender, but by freedom. A free Viking woman had rights that wouldn't appear elsewhere in Europe for centuries. She could divorce her husband, own land, run a business, but even her freedom was rooted in domination. She had to be strong, cunning, and willing to fight for her space in a world ruled by war. A woman who married a weak man could leave him for being too gentle in bed. The sagas tell stories of women mocking their husbands for failing to act aggressively enough. In one tale, a woman divorces her husband because he wore a shirt that showed too much of his chest. To her, this wasn't fashion, it was weakness, and weakness was betrayal. Meanwhile, enslaved women had no such power. They were property, used for labor, traded for alliances, and exploited sexually with legal protection for their abusers. Raping a free woman was punishable by death. Raping a slave, that was a fine, often paid like a tax, less than the price of a cow. This split between free and unfree women reveals the true core of Viking morality. It wasn't about right or wrong, it was about who had the power to choose. Free women were sacred because they could refuse. Enslaved women had no agency and no identity. Their worth was in their usefulness. Their pain was invisible. And that belief made the entire system work, because the Vikings weren't just conquerors, they were traders, slavers, strategists. They built economies around the trafficking of human bodies. In Dublin, York, and across the rivers of the Baltic, Viking slave markets flourished, and among the most valued commodities were young women taken for sexual use. This was not secret, this was normal. The sagas speak of it casually, as if it were no more important than counting sheep. Raiders would divide the most attractive captives among themselves, reserving the finest for their leaders. Some were kept in private harems, others were sold across the known world. Many never saw their homes again. All of this, the laws, the customs, the gods, the markets, created one of the most elaborate systems of sexual power ever seen in early medieval Europe. And it set the stage for everything that followed: the public wedding consummations, the humiliating punishments for passive men, the ritual rape and murder during funerals. None of it happened in isolation. It was all part of a deeper logic, a structure that said your worth is what you can take, not what you feel. That's why what Ibn Fadlan saw in 922 wasn't an aberration, it was a climax. The Viking chieftain's funeral, where a slave girl was chosen to be drugged, violated, and killed, wasn't just a ceremony. It was a final act of dominance, a message to the gods and the tribe that even in death, the man retained control. His body may be gone, but his power would be carried into the next world through her. This was Viking morality. This was Viking law. This was Viking faith. And if it seems brutal, ask yourself this: why does so much of it still feel familiar? When we fear being seen as weak, when we mock men for not performing, when we judge women for how much agency they claim, when we still divide people into strong or submissive, worthy or disposable, that's not modern shame, that's ancient design. And we haven't unlearned it, we've just hidden it better. The Viking world did not wait for conflict, it invited it. Honor was not something you inherited, it was something you defended constantly, like a crumbling wall after every storm. And the biggest storm of all was not war, but insult, especially the kind that questioned your manhood. It didn't take much. One word, one rumor, one look held too long across the fire, and suddenly you weren't just embarrassed. You were at risk of social death. You could lose everything over a whisper. The word arga was not spoken lightly. It didn't just mean weak, it meant perverse. It meant deviant. It meant you were not in control of your own body, and therefore not in control of anything. To be accused of it was to be thrown out of society without trial, unless you did something about it. And so the first act in many Viking dramas was not an axe to the throat, but an insult to the soul. The sagas are full of it. In the saga of Burnt Njal, a man named Flosi insults another man's masculinity during a legal proceeding. The insult spreads like fire, and soon the court becomes a battleground, and the dispute escalates into a full-scale blood feud that burns homes, kills friends, and destroys families. All because of a sentence, all because of doubt. In Egil's saga, the famous warrior poet Egil Skallagrimsson rides across hundreds of miles to kill a man who once called him soft in front of others. He doesn't forget, he doesn't forgive, because in Viking society, memory was a weapon. If someone said it, others would remember, and if others remembered, you were finished. This is why insults in Viking culture carried more legal weight than theft. A stolen horse could be replaced, but your status, once damaged, rarely recovered. There was no rehabilitation, only retribution. And so men fought, not just for land, not just for gold, but for the right to never be seen beneath another. That's what drove so many Viking actions. This deep, gnawing fear of being reduced, of being seen as the passive one. Because passivity in this world wasn't harmless, it was contamination. If another man joked that you were too gentle in bed, you couldn't laugh it off. Laughter was weakness. You had to correct the insult with violence, with sex, with death. And often they did all three. Some men responded by marrying multiple women, others by keeping slaves for sexual display. A few took it further, using sexual humiliation as revenge. This wasn't about pleasure, it was performance, a kind of theatre where the audience was the tribe and the script was survival. Women understood this too, especially free women who lived inside the same hierarchy. They could destroy a man's reputation with a single accusation. In the Laxdala saga, a woman divorces her husband by calling him soft in front of others. She says he touches her like a woman, not a man. He loses face. She keeps the land. And this wasn't seen as cruelty. It was seen as power. Because a woman's reputation also depended on her ability to choose strength over submission. If she tolerated a weak man, she became weak by association. That's how tight the system was. Everyone was bound to it. Everyone had something to lose. And the most terrifying part was this. The rules were not written in some book. They were carried in glances, in stories, in what people whispered over meat and mead. You never knew when someone might test your role, so you stayed on guard. You bragged more than you believed, you fought harder than you needed, you made sure no one ever had the chance to say you weren't in control, not even in jest. This is why Viking violence wasn't random, it was rehearsed. They were trained not just to win wars, but to win reputations. And if sex was the stage, then dominance was the only acceptable script. That's why even peaceful acts had to be witnessed as power. Marriages, inheritances, funerals, even blessings from gods had to come with proof, physical, legal, or sexual. Men were not just born, they were declared, approved, witnessed, and anything that fell short of that process became a threat. This obsessive need to avoid shame created a world where people went to horrifying lengths to protect their image. They murdered friends, they assaulted neighbors, they staged public performances of intimacy and punishment, not because they were depraved, but because they were terrified of what silence meant. To be quiet was to risk being forgotten. To be passive was to risk being erased. And in the Viking world, erasure was worse than death. It is easy to look back and call it brutal. And it was. But it was also deeply human, because at its heart, Viking culture was built on fear. The fear of being unloved, the fear of being powerless, the fear of being labeled something you could never undo. And that fear led to the first cut. The insult, the response, the blood, the fire had started. And soon it would spread into weddings, into law, into ritual, into things far darker than anyone outside the North could imagine. Because the Vikings didn't just defend their homes with axes, they defended their identity with bodies. In Viking society, a wedding was not just a celebration, it was a legally binding contract that had to be proven. Not with signatures, but with sex. The ceremony itself was full of rituals, each symbolizing the transfer of power from one family to another, and from woman to man. Yet the most crucial part of the wedding came after the feast, when the couple was escorted to their marital bed, not in private, but under the watch of family and guests. Their union would only be recognized if it ended in consummation, and sometimes that proof had to be heard, seen, or even physically examined. This was not an occasional custom. It was embedded in Viking law and social expectation. Without physical evidence of penetration, sometimes bloodied sheets, sometimes eyewitnesses, the bride's family could demand the return of the dowry. In some cases, relatives remained outside the bedroom, listening carefully, ready to challenge the legitimacy of the marriage if things fell silent. If you failed to perform, you didn't just disappoint your bride, you failed her entire lineage, and they had legal and social grounds to punish you for it. For many Viking men, the wedding night became a performance under extreme pressure. It was not about affection or excitement, but about proving dominance in front of a community that judged your worth by your ability to control. To be too gentle was to risk your masculinity. To fail entirely was to risk your reputation. Viking law codes included specific punishments for sexual failure on the wedding night, sometimes demanding restitution or fines for what was seen as a breach of contract. The symbolism didn't stop at the bedroom. During the ceremony itself, Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, was placed in the bride's lap to invoke fertility, a public gesture that left little to the imagination. Guests would often pass the hammer around, treating it as a sacred totem of male power and virility. When the groom removed the bride's bridal crown, it was understood as a sign that her virginity was now his possession. The entire event was built to display a transfer of control, not mutual love, and the community didn't just attend, it validated. Even the morning after was part of the legal system. The couple was expected to display the bedsheets, stained with blood, as evidence of a successful union. These sheets could be kept as legal proof in future disputes over inheritance or marriage fraud. If no blood was found, it could mean the bride was not a virgin, which could lead to social ruin or lawsuits. If the groom failed to produce any evidence of consummation, it reflected on his ability as a man and his claim to authority. Marriages in Viking society were a public declaration of masculine dominance backed by law, ceremony, and community surveillance. Behind all of this was fear. The fear of failure, the fear of shame, and the fear of being seen as weak. Viking culture left no room for vulnerability. Every man was under constant evaluation, and every woman's body was treated as proof of a man's worth. Even women, empowered by the legal system, used these rituals to maintain their own status by divorcing men who failed to perform. The ritual wasn't just to bless a union, it was to test the man's place in the social order. The sagas offer countless examples of these humiliations. In one case, a woman mocked her husband for his softness in bed and divorced him in public, retaining the land and wealth brought into the marriage. In another, a groom failed to consummate the marriage and was labeled unmanly, a status that haunted him for the rest of his life. These weren't isolated events, they were recorded and passed down because the community needed reminders of what happened when a man failed to uphold his end of the hierarchy. Shame became a story, and stories became law. Even love, if it existed, had to obey these structures. A man could love his bride, but he still had to prove he was above her in status, control, and power. A woman could admire her husband, but if he did not dominate her properly in bed, she had the legal right to leave. This was not about desire, this was about maintaining the boundaries of power at all times, including during the most intimate acts. The bedroom was never private, it was just another arena where Viking status could rise or collapse. And yet, this pressure to perform did not end with the wedding night. It extended into the daily expectations of marriage. A man who was too affectionate could be mocked. A woman who didn't obey could be punished. Children were raised watching these patterns, learning early that dominance was sacred and passivity, in either gender, was dangerous. Intimacy was something you survived, not something you shared. And all of it fed back into the same system, the same obsession with control. This obsession made Viking marriages feel more like transactions than relationships. Families arranged them with strategic intent, hoping to expand influence or merge property. Feelings were irrelevant. What mattered was the physical proof that the man had taken what was promised. This turned women into objects of legal transfer and men into performers under unrelenting pressure. It also created a culture where failure was feared more than death. And so the rituals repeated over and over across generations. Brides placed under hammers, grooms led to rooms with watchful relatives standing guard, bloodied sheets displayed like trophies, reputations built or destroyed based on moans heard through wooden doors. There was no room for mercy, only measurement. The Vikings didn't just legalize sex, they legislated shame, and by doing so they created a system where intimacy was a test of character, failure was a form of treason, and love, if it existed at all, was always second to power. In the year 922, a Muslim diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan stood on the frozen banks of the Volga River and witnessed something that would never leave him. He had been sent from the Abbasid Caliphate to meet with the Bulgars, but his journey brought him face to face with the Viking Rus, a tribe of Norsemen who had settled along the river routes of Eastern Europe. At first, he was fascinated by their strength, their tall frames, and their brutal honesty. But that fascination soon turned to horror, because what he saw was not just a funeral, it was a sacred performance of power, sexuality, and sacrifice. A Viking chieftain had died, and his people prepared to send him into the afterlife in a way they believed preserved his status and strength. But death alone was not enough. The chief had to be accompanied, honored, and spiritually rearmed. That required a vessel, a human offering, who could carry his masculine essence into the next world. For this, they turned to his slaves and asked a chilling question: which of you will die with him? One young woman volunteered. Perhaps she believed it was an honor. Perhaps she had been raised to think her sacrifice would elevate her soul. Perhaps she simply knew that refusing wasn't truly an option. Whatever her reason, her fate was sealed. She would become the vessel of legacy, a physical container for the tribe's collective spiritual energy. For 10 days, the slave girl was kept in isolation. During that time, she was given increasingly large quantities of alcohol. She was visited by men from the tribe, each entering her tent with solemn faces and exiting with pride. They believed they were filling her with power, transferring their life force through intimacy. After each act, they would whisper, "Tell your master I did this out of love for him." To them, this was not abuse, it was devotion. As the day of the funeral arrived, the ritual reached its peak. A large wooden ship had been prepared, resting on land like a stage. The chieftain's body was laid inside, surrounded by his finest weapons, clothing, and goods. Animals were sacrificed nearby, horses, dogs, and livestock, all to accompany him into the next world. Then came the girl. She was led forward by an old woman known as the Angel of Death, whose job was to prepare her for the final journey. What happened next was recorded by Ibn Fadlan in detail so precise it reads like a horror script. The girl was taken to the ship and given one last round of alcohol. 6 men entered the ship's tent with her, each one taking turns with her while the rest of the tribe stood outside, chanting and waiting. She was then laid next to the chieftain's corpse. The Angel of Death came forward with a rope and a dagger. First, the girl was strangled with the cord, pulled from behind by 2 men while the old woman covered her face. Then, while she struggled, the Angel of Death stabbed her twice in the ribs with a blade. Her body twitched, then went still. In Viking belief, this final act, the mixture of sex, blood, and death, sealed the ritual. It guaranteed that the chief would not enter the next world alone, and that he would carry with him the energy of all those who had loved him before he left. The ship was then set on fire. Flames consumed the wood, the furs, the animals, the girl, and the dead man lying beside her. Ibn Fadlan watched in silence, unable to comprehend what he had seen. To the Vikings, it was a holy moment. To him, it was an abomination wrapped in ceremony. And to us, it is one of the most detailed historical accounts we have of how sex, violence, and spirituality could be bound together in a single belief system. Modern archaeology has confirmed parts of his story. In burial mounds like Oseberg in Norway and others across Scandinavia, remains of women have been found alongside high-status men with clear signs of violent death. Some were strangled, others were stabbed, a few had both. This wasn't myth, this wasn't exaggeration, it was policy performed with devotion. What stands out in this ritual is not just its brutality, but its logic. The Vikings believed that power had to be transferred through intimate channels. Not just physically, but spiritually. To them, sex wasn't just a personal act. It was a conveyor of strength, a ritual bridge between the living and the dead. And when that belief was institutionalized, it justified everything, even murder. But the horror goes deeper when you understand the emotional framework behind it. This was not cruelty for its own sake, it was an expression of cosmic order. If the chief died without being fed the energy of the living, he might wander lost in the afterlife. If the girl wasn't used as a vessel, his masculine identity might fade. In their eyes, the ritual was mercy. Brutal, yes, but necessary. Dignified, even noble. And yet there is no escaping the truth that what they called sacred, we now call abuse. That what they believed honored the dead, in fact, destroyed the living. That their vision of control stretched so far it reached beyond the grave. The slave girl was never asked if she believed in Valhalla. Her body was not hers to keep. Her life, her death, and even her final breath became tools in a man's legacy. This is where the Viking obsession with dominance reaches its most complete form. In weddings, sex proved your worth. In court, insults justified murder. And in death, your control was measured by how many bodies you carried with you. Control over women, control over fear, control over the very act of dying. Ibn Fadlan's record survived not because it was poetic, but because it was impossible to forget. He described not only what he saw, but what he felt, a quiet dread that lingered in his words like the smoke from that burning ship. He knew what most didn't want to admit, that this wasn't a fringe ritual, it was the pinnacle of a belief system. A society so consumed with proving power that it turned even funerals into theatre. And the crowd applauded. By the time Viking warriors returned from raids, they weren't just bringing back gold and livestock, they brought people. And among the most valued captives were young women, chosen not for their skills, but for their bodies. These women were sorted, priced, and sold across Viking markets in Dublin, York, and beyond. It wasn't just an afterthought, it was business. Sexual slavery wasn't a consequence of Viking raids, it was a strategy. Women were captured precisely because they could be used, traded, or gifted to warriors as signs of loyalty or payment. The most attractive were often reserved for chieftains kept in longhouses for personal use. The rest were paraded like livestock. Some were sold into households, others into brothels. All were stripped of their names and given new value, measured in flesh. The sagas mention these exchanges casually, almost coldly, like noting the sale of a good horse. A man might return from Ireland with 12 slaves, 4 of whom were chosen for pleasure. There was no shame in this system. For the owners. Only for the owned. The enslaved had no legal protection, no recourse. They weren't people. They were property. Viking legal codes reflected this without flinching. If a man raped a free woman, he could be sentenced to death. If he raped a slave, he might pay a small fine, usually less than what one would pay for damaging a neighbor's fence. The law wasn't broken, it was honored, because the law existed to protect the dominant, not the vulnerable, and the line between who deserved protection and who didn't was drawn clearly in status, blood, and gender. But this wasn't just a hidden economy, it was a visible culture. Vikings didn't hide their slaves, they displayed them, especially the ones used for sex. These women became objects of public knowledge, symbols of wealth, virility, and power. Owning many slaves wasn't shameful, it was aspirational. This culture of dominance crept into every corner of Viking society, even into their justice system. Public punishment didn't just serve to enforce law, it served to entertain. Criminals weren't just executed, they were humiliated first, often sexually. A rapist might be raped in front of a crowd, not to avenge the victim, but to flip the shame back onto the accused. The point wasn't healing, it was spectacle. Crowds gathered not to mourn, but to cheer, as if pain could be purified by performance. Adulterers might be castrated in public, their cries treated like music, their mutilation a lesson, and children watched. They learned early that dominance wasn't just about protection, it was about control over every part of the body, yours or someone else's. Festivals sometimes featured captured enemies being forced into degrading acts, not just to kill them, but to unman them. The more shame they endured before death, the greater the victory. Warriors boasted not of how fast they won, but how thoroughly they broke their captives, and the more humiliating the defeat, the more status it gave to the conqueror. The saga of the Vikings describes tournaments where prisoners were sexually mocked, stripped and tortured in creative ways, all while crowds bet on how long they would last. It wasn't enough to spill blood. You had to rewrite someone's entire identity before you ended their life. This was not madness, this was tradition. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Because when we see modern violence dressed in humor, when we cheer at degradation disguised as justice, when we turn private pain into public content, we are walking roads the Vikings paved. Even their most sacred places were stained by this logic. Temples, courtrooms, longhouses, all saw their share of public spectacle. The separation between justice and vengeance was almost non-existent. A punishment only worked if it could be seen, if it could be remembered, if it left a mark, not just on the body, but on the tribe's memory. What made this so powerful was that it worked. People obeyed. Not because they believed in mercy, but because they feared public erasure. To be shamed in front of your community was worse than death, because you had to keep living with it, and everyone else kept watching. The people who suffered most in this system were not always the ones who died. Many lived, but they lived outside the lines, banished, silent, used. A man accused of weakness might never again be invited to speak in public. A woman who refused a chief might be turned into a warning. These were not just punishments, they were stories, repeated until they became rules. The line between ritual and cruelty blurred completely. When enough people cheer, even horror starts to look like culture. And when cruelty becomes performance, the audience forgets to ask who it's really for. So the Vikings continued. They turned sex into spectacle, shame into status, pain into participation. And the more they normalized it, the more they spread it. Because the Vikings didn't just invade with weapons, they invaded with ideas. And the most powerful idea of all was that your body, and what others did to it, was never really yours. Viking culture, when stripped of its spectacle and saga, reveals something unsettlingly familiar. At its core was not just violence, but emotional engineering. It taught men to fear softness, to fear inaction, to fear being anything other than the one in control. And it taught women to survive by aligning with dominance or wielding it themselves, never by being neutral. This wasn't just a society of warriors, it was a society of people trained to measure self-worth by what they could take or withstand. This emotional structure of dominance over vulnerability created a loop that fed itself. The more shame a man feared, the more violent he became to escape it. The more women were seen as trophies or threats, the more tightly their bodies were controlled. And when anyone tried to break free of these roles, they became targets of mockery, punishment, or exile. It wasn't personal, it was cultural maintenance. The reason Viking laws allowed murder over insults wasn't because they loved death, it was because they feared erosion of reputation, of clarity, of roles. In a world where everything was uncertain, harvests, weather, alliances, the only stable structure was the hierarchy of control. That's what made their sexuality so political. It wasn't about desire. It was about declaring who mattered. The active partner kept his honor, the passive partner lost his name. Women were sorted by whether they were free or enslaved. Men were sorted by whether they gave or received. In battle, in bed, in everything. Even the gods weren't safe from scrutiny. Odin, who practiced feminine magic, was both revered and ridiculed. Loki, who gave birth as a woman, was mocked more for that than for his betrayals. Viking myths didn't just tell stories, They mirrored the emotional logic of their people, that masculinity was fragile, that femininity was risky, and that shame had to be surgically removed no matter the cost. And the cost was enormous. Victims of this system weren't just the slaves burned alive or the warriors who failed to perform. The victims were everyone, because everyone was being watched. Everyone was being tested. Every act was public. Every silence was suspicious. That kind of scrutiny doesn't just hurt bodies, it breaks minds. But here's what matters most. These ideas didn't vanish when the Viking Age ended. They traveled through trade, through law, through legend. They soaked into neighboring cultures, influencing medieval law, inheritance customs, and gender expectations across Europe. Even today, their fingerprints remain. Why does the word emasculated still sting more than immoral? Why is performance anxiety often framed as a loss of identity? Why are court cases still fought over consummation? Why do certain insults carry more emotional weight than physical ones? These aren't random quirks of modern society. They are the descendants of Viking belief systems. Systems that told us your worth is not what you are, but what you can prove. In front of others, with your body, against your shame. Modern masculinity still echoes these patterns. You see it when men refuse to ask for help because they fear appearing weak. You see it in the pressure to dominate in sex, in work, in social settings. You see it in playgrounds, locker rooms, boardrooms, and bedrooms. This unspoken rule that to be a man is to never be below. That softness must be hidden, and submission must be denied. Even more disturbing is how these ideas still justify violence. Sexual humiliation continues to be used as a weapon in war, from Bosnia to Rwanda, from Guantanamo Bay to Russian prisons. Dominant forces have always known that shame wounds deeper than blood. And that belief didn't come from nowhere. It came from long, dark traditions where control was passed down through bodies like a ritual, a performance with terrible consequences. For women, the legacy is just as heavy. Today, women are still judged by their sexuality more than their ability. Virginity is still discussed as value. Clothing is still debated in courtrooms. The idea that a woman's worth is tied to her availability, her purity, or her respectability is a ghost of Viking legal codes dressed in modern clothing. And yet, despite all this, there is something almost human in how the Vikings tried to make sense of fear. They feared chaos, so they created rules. They feared shame, so they created punishments. They feared vulnerability, so they wrapped it in rituals of strength. It doesn't make what they did right, but it makes it understandable, because deep down, every society finds a way to survive its own insecurities. The Vikings just carved theirs into bone. Their story is not just about brutality, it's about what happens when fear becomes structure, when identity is reduced to performance, when people are so desperate to avoid humiliation that they sacrifice compassion, silence empathy, and turn intimacy into spectacle. So the question isn't why the Vikings did what they did. The real question is, why do we still understand it so well? Why do we still reward dominance and punish submission? Why do we call survivors of assault damaged, but celebrate aggressors as strong? Why do we cheer when someone is shamed publicly, but feel uneasy when someone cries? Because the Viking system didn't just train their people, it trained ours. It taught us to rank each other and ourselves. And we've kept the rankings alive even if we forgot where they came from. But now you know. Now you know why performance feels like pressure, why silence feels like failure, why control is so often mistaken for confidence, and why even today, in a world full of rights and reforms, so many people are still trapped in rituals they never chose. The Vikings burned their shame on pyres and called it glory. We bury ours in algorithms and call it culture. The tools have changed, the fear has not. We began with a single insult that could cost a man his life. We walked through weddings that doubled as courtrooms, funerals that masked horror as honor, and a justice system that used shame as both weapon and entertainment. We saw how Viking society forged its power through ritual, through sex, through silence, and we saw how deeply it feared anything that resembled softness, vulnerability, or loss of control. But what we saw most clearly was ourselves. Because for all the distance in time, so much of what the Vikings built still survives, not in their ships or swords, but in the quiet expectations that shape modern lives, in the way a boy learns early not to cry, in the way a woman's worth is questioned through her body, in the way shame is whispered, then enforced. These ideas don't shout. They don't wear fur or carry axes anymore. But they live on in courtrooms, in bedrooms, in jokes, in rituals we don't recognize as rituals. They show up in divorce proceedings that hinge on sexual failure, in wars where rape is a tactic, in cultural moments where domination still equals strength. We think we've evolved, but sometimes we've only changed the scenery. The Vikings burned their dead with sex and fire. We bury our guilt under performance and silence. They believed that shame could be erased through public control. We pretend shame doesn't exist, and then punish those who reveal it. The structure remains. Only the costumes have changed. So what do we do with this? We don't need to become Vikings to understand their legacy, but we do need to question how much of their fear still lives in us. How many of our laws, relationships, and identities still echo their belief that to be submissive is to be less, and how often we confuse dominance with worth. Because maybe the bravest thing isn't to dominate. Maybe the bravest thing is to stop performing, to step outside the ritual, to let the shame burn itself out, not through violence, but through truth. And maybe when we do that, we finally become something the Vikings never allowed: free.